Early in 2009, after years of suicide bombing in Israel by Palestinian militias, especially Hamas, Binyamin Netanyahu was about to win an election by calling himself Mr. Security. He was saying that only he could provide the national security that Israel needed and the personal security that Israelis craved after years of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, the Second Intifada, and after years of other violence that caused Israelis to lose faith in the idea that there would imminently be a two-state solution, that Israel and Palestine would form as two neighboring states which could live after a fashion, at peace with each other, the way that Israel lives at peace with Egypt and with Jordan. So, for a period of years after being elected as Mr. Security, Netanyahu presided over years of continued violence against Israel by Hamas in particular, and a continued perception, a developing perception in Israel, that Israel's enemies, especially Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, were implacable, ruthless, unstoppable enemies, and that there could be no policy solution that would create a peaceful and secure environment for Israelis to live with their neighbors. And over that period of time, remarkably, repeated Israeli national security failures and strategic failures did not result in Netanyahu becoming perceived as a national security failure, as Mr. Non-Security. I've made a few notes. 3 years after he was elected, Israelis were killed in a suicide bombing of a bus in Bulgaria. And later that year, later in 2012, the Israelis conduct Operation Pillar of Defense. 2 years of comparative quiet. 5 years after Netanyahu is elected as Mr. Security, 3 Israeli kids living in the West Bank are kidnapped and murdered by Hamas operators. And there's some question whether they were acting on Hamas orders or just doing this, I don't even want to say, recreationally. They were freelance. Anyway, it doesn't matter. They were kidnapped, they were murdered, and shortly thereafter, the Israelis conduct Operation Protective Edge against Hamas. 12 years after Netanyahu is elected as Mr. Security, the Israelis are conducting Operation Guardian of the Walls in May of 21. And of course, there's only a 2.5-year gap between that operation and the so-called Al-Aqsa flood, that is the Hamas attacks into southern Israel on the 7th of October 2023. One might think that Netanyahu, on whose watch that last failure took place, would resign in disgrace. More Israelis killed than at any other moment in Israeli history. And yet, Netanyahu is able to sustain the idea that he had to remain in office because only he could conclude successfully the destruction of Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, and maybe the Houthis. And over the course of the intervening period, you might think that Netanyahu might be held to account for failing to protect Israelis. But over the course of that period, Netanyahu looked at some points as though he might be conducting the destruction of Hamas, the destruction of Hezbollah, the destruction of the Islamic regime in Iran and its replacement with a more amenable regime. Netanyahu could have gone into this autumn's elections as Mr. Security, but again he failed. Netanyahu failed to destroy Hamas. And one reason he failed to destroy Hamas is that his closeness with American policymakers, with the White House, meant that the Israelis stopped destroying Hamas at America's behest. They got a number of their hostages back alive and others dead. But Hamas has lived to fight another day. Hezbollah, given a tremendous kicking, the pagers, the precision attacks on Hamas targets in Beirut, and now Hezbollah targets in Beirut. But Hezbollah has been spared by the American decision to agree a ceasefire with Iran that requires Israel, not consulted, to stop operating against Hezbollah. And of course, Iran, the Iranian regime, not changed. Iran's ability to attack Israel impaired but not removed. And there is every sign that Iran will continue with its ballistic missile program, with its proxies intact, and with its nuclear program intact, if damaged. So Netanyahu is in the odd position of having spent 16 years in office not achieving security for Israelis. And there is, setting aside the question whether he makes national security policy with an eye towards remaining in office long enough for charges of corruption against him to disappear, there is the idea that Netanyahu and right-wing Israelis have started to put forward that Israel is a kind of Sparta, a state which exists in a state of perpetual war with its neighbors. As though Sparta were some kind of achievement, right? Did the Spartans emerge from the classical period with any accomplishments other than being known to have been mobilized for continuous war? When we read Xenophon, are we watching the 10,000 get out of Persia and go back to the paradise that was Sparta? We are seeing Israel trying to copy the Russians, trying to copy the North Koreans and the Iranians and achieve some kind of permanent state of war. And as the Russian economy really starts to go to bits, trying to sustain a long war against Ukraine with no appreciable success, no appreciable strategic success, we have to ask whether Israel is going to make a success of conducting permanent warfare against Hamas, Hezbollah, and of course Iran, or whether Netanyahu will be defeated in this autumn's elections by people with better proposals, a better chance of offering Israelis security. And rather than calling themselves Mr. Security, becoming a government that can deliver policy and strategy that could result in long-term Israeli strategy that could result in Israel living at peace with its neighbors.